Today, I want to talk about public education. It seems like everyone in America, across the political spectrum, is upset, dissatisfied with education and how kids are taught. You have people on the left who are freaking out about Governor Ron DeSantis making changes in Florida. You have people on the right freaking out about critical race nonsense and woke lesson plans. And this is not a new phenomenon. I remember people freaking out when Barack Obama was president and he was pushing Common Core standards, and Michelle Obama was on a mission to destroy lunches in public schools in the name of nutrition. I know that the religious right has been butthurt for years about evolution being taught as a science in schools. Occasionally, I read stories about how some schools in the South are trying to whitewash U.S. history, particularly with the Civil War. Constantly seeing headlines about certain books that are being banned in certain districts. It never ends. It never ends. Meanwhile, I'm over here thinking, what did you knuckleheads think was going to happen when you put the state in charge of teaching your kids? Did you guys just assume that there was always going to be a rational, non-corrupt, non-shady person leading your city, leading your state, leading your country, representing you in Congress or the Senate, chairing the Department of Education? Did you guys always think that politicians would not try to teach your kids some crazy shit? Like, say, I don't know, maybe that we'd be better off if the Supreme Court did not overturn segregation in the famous Brown versus the Board of Education ruling? Now, some of you guys might be thinking, holy crap, is that what they're teaching in states like Mississippi these days? Is that how bad things have gotten? Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do know that this is the opinion of Derek Bell, one of the founding intellectuals of critical race theory. And maybe they're not teaching this in schools yet, but it is a theory that a lot of clueless liberals are diving on grenades for to own the conservatives, saying stuff like, it's just an honest teaching of history, you guys. So I guess if we keep looking to CRT intellectuals like Derek Bell, maybe this is the perspective on history that we can look forward to.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
So I'm over here thinking maybe it's time we privatize education in America. Make schooling and teaching far less political, put more power in the hands of parents and students, and let them decide which school, however crazy the school may be, let parents and students decide which schools they want to go to. And I know a lot of people are about to be like, but we can't leave education to the free market. A lot of people, they always say, what about the poor? What about the children? What about children whose parents cannot afford to send them to school? Is it fair to these kids for them to get left behind? Kids in poor families, they might never become proficient in things like reading and writing and arithmetic, which will make it even harder for them to rise out of poverty. And it's like I always say, what about the children is the most cowardly, yet most effective argument in American politics. But I would say, doesn't this already happen? Despite the abundance of public education and the generous amounts of money that we spend on public education. According to an article in May of 2021 put out by the United States Census about public school spending, New York State spends about $25,000 per student per year on education, whereas New York City spends $28,000 per student per year on education. And you would think with this much money that they're spending in New York State, New York City, that their schools would be the envy of the world, envy of the country. You'd think they'd be having incredible results when it comes to stuff like proficiency in arithmetic and reading. According to the New York's Department on Education, this is their website on proficiency in stuff like math and arithmetic. They put out a press release on this issue. In 2019, statewide, again, they spend $25,000 per student per year statewide in New York State. And in 2019, less than half of the students, nearly 1 million students took this test, grades 3 through 8. Less than half the students were proficient in the English language arts, which includes reading, writing, and speaking. Meanwhile, less than half were proficient in math. In New York City, as you can see, they're comparing New York City with New York State. New York City, again, they spend $28,000 per student per year on education. According to this article for Yahoo News, the national average for annual private school tuition in 2021 is approximately $11,600. So $28,000, that's well above $11,600. $28,000 per student per year in New York City. Less than half of the students are proficient in math. Just 45.6% of the students in New York City are proficient. In English language arts, 47.4% are proficient. And again, this is why we can't have privatized education, because we might have kids fall behind. We might have a crisis of too many kids falling behind in reading and writing and math proficiency. Meanwhile, in New York City, they spend $28,000 per student per year on education, and over half the kids are not proficient in reading, writing, and arithmetic. But it's not just New York City. Going back to the article from the census, Boston, Massachusetts, public schools, they spend $25,600 per student per year on education. According to U.S. News and World Report, which according to them, Boston public schools, they spend $25,200. So sounds like their data is kind of in line with the U.S. Census, but according to this article, Boston public schools, high school students in Boston public schools, only 31% are proficient in math, 32% are proficient in reading. Now, this is U.S. News and World Report. From what I saw, people were kind of mixed on whether or not this source is reputable. I think they specialize in grading and ranking schools and universities. From what I saw, people said, yeah, it's not unreliable, but maybe take it with a grain of salt. So why don't we look at the nation's report card, which is part of the National Assessment for Educational Progress. This is done by the United States Federal Department of Education, part of the National Center for Education Statistics. It's, according to this, Boston 8th graders, again, $25,000 per student per year. This is the results they get. In 2019, about 28% or more were graded as proficient in reading, according to this report. Now, there is a lot of controversy around the nation's report card. According to this article from Brookings Institute, written by Tom Lovelace in 2016, their definition of proficiency is not the common standard definition. This is only applying to the National Assessment for Educational Progress. According to this article, proficient by NAEP standards means competency over challenging subject matter. It is not the same thing as being on grade level. So now I'm wondering, does basic mean grade level? Because even according to this, in 2019, 34% of Boston 8th graders were fell below the NAEP basic standards, meaning only 66% of Boston 8th graders were above the basic standards. Now, by grade school definitions of grading, wouldn't Boston public schools, they would get a D grade, and is that good? Are we proud of this?
Absolutely fucking not.
But again, we're citing the nation's report card in U.S. News and World Report, So going forward, I'm going to talk about a variety of districts using other sources other than U.S. News and World Report and the nation's report card. Starting with the Chicago Public School District. This is according to the National Center for Education Statistics. According to this, the Chicago public schools spend $18,000 to $19,000 per student per year on public education. And what kind of results are they getting in Chicago? According to this article from the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago public school students' test scores dropped during pandemic, mirroring statewide trend, new data shows. This was in December of 2021 by Nader Issa. Talks about how the Illinois Assessment of Readiness is a spring exam measuring 3rd through 8th grade students' mastery of math and English grade level standards. At Chicago Public Schools, 21% of kids met or exceeded English standards this year. We're talking about 2020 compared to 28% in 2019. In math, only 16% met or exceeded expectations. Similar trends, though not as steep, were seen in the SAT college entrance exam administered to 11th graders. About 23% of students met or exceeded expectations in English, whereas 21% reached satisfactory levels in math in Chicago public schools on the SAT. This is what you get for $18,000 to $19,000 per student per year. Now, this article tries to use the pandemic as an excuse. It's also worth noting that the Chicago public schools, their workforce is unionized. Going back to New York City, from what I've seen, New York City teachers, they're also unionized. We're talking about socialism in education. The government now has a near monopoly on education in a lot of these districts. They spend a generous amount of money on these school districts. The workforces in in a lot of these school districts are unionized. And they say we can't leave education to the free market because kids might fall behind in stuff like reading, writing, and math. It looks like it already happens, despite all these socialist ideas implemented in education. But this was to the chagrin of Chicago's Democrat Mayor Lori Lightfoot, as earlier this year they tried to keep schools closed for the teachers. Going to Detroit public schools. According to Wikipedia, data I got from Wikipedia, which they cite documents provided by the websites from the Detroit Public School District. Detroit spends roughly $15,500 per student per year on education. Going back to this article on Yahoo News by Karen Doyle in August of 2021, the average cost of private school in the state of Michigan is about $7,000, $7,200. So Detroit Public Schools spends twice that per year on education. And what are the results we see there? According to this article in the Detroit Free Press in 2019 from John Wisely, citing the Michigan Student Test of Educational Progress, also known as MSTEP, in Michigan's largest district, the Detroit Public Schools Community District, scores were well below the state average. Just 11.9% of third graders who attend Detroit Public Schools tested proficient in English language arts. In math, 10% of Detroit students tested proficient. In social studies, still remain low, just about 5% testing proficient. I guess this is what $15,000 gets you in the city of Detroit. Now we're going to jump over to Los Angeles Unified Public School District. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, Los Angeles Unified Public Schools spend roughly $19,000 to $20,000 per student per year on education. According to an article from the LA Times in 2019 by Sonali Kohli, only half of California students meet English standards and fewer meet math standards. So this is state of California, but in this article, they isolate data for LA Unified Public Schools. And according to this article, In 2019, 44% of students in LA Unified Public Schools were proficient in English language arts, whereas only 33% were proficient in mathematics. Again, guys, we can't have private schools because kids might not learn to read, write, or do math. It looks like we're already getting similar results in public schools with unionized teachers that spend $19,000 to $20,000 per student per year on public education.
That's just not smart.
Also with California public schools, remember the state of California discussed maybe introducing some anti-racist curriculum in their math classes. Well, maybe you should focus on making sure that more of your kids are proficient in math before you bring some anti-racist math curriculum into the schools. Gavin. And then there's the Baltimore Public School District. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, they spend roughly $20,000 to $21,000 per student per year on public education. There was an article put out in February, just 2 months ago, February of 2022, that reported that more than 75% of students test at elementary level in math and reading at a Baltimore City high school. I guess according to this article, on average, Baltimore public schools receive $16,000 per student per year. That's still a lot. According to this article, one of the most alarming findings came in January when a Baltimore City teacher came forward with information showing more than 75% of students tested at one high school are reading and doing math at elementary school level. The teacher works at Patterson High School, one of the largest high schools in Baltimore. The school has a 61% graduation rate with a $12 million budget. Again, guys, this is why we can't have private schools, because some kids might fall behind. Going back to the National Center for Education Statistics, Minneapolis public schools, I guess, spend between $20,000 and $21,000 per student per year on public education. Sounds like a lot of money to me. According to an article in Star Tribune in October of 2021, half of Minneapolis public school students cannot read at grade level, a statistic that is long held true, and some parents are losing patience. And I guess if we go back to U.S. News and World Report, according to this source, Minneapolis public schools spend roughly $17,400 per student per year. And 23% of Minneapolis high school students are proficient in mathematics, while only 39% are proficient in reading. Then there's Cleveland Public Schools, another large city in the state of Ohio. According to data from Wikipedia, Cleveland Public Schools spend roughly $21,500 per student per year on education. And according to this article from NBC4 in Columbus that reports that 4 out of 5 Columbus third graders are not proficient in reading. It compares it with other districts, including Cleveland, which shows that roughly 35% of Cleveland third graders in public schools are proficient at reading. So that's a variety of school districts I've talked about where I'm relying on sources other than Nation's Report Card and U.S. News and World Report. Now, let me say this. There is a lot more nuance to this discussion, more than public schools versus private schools, more than capitalism versus socialism, and whether or not enough money is being spent on public education. The main reason why I bring this up is because whenever education is discussed, many people assume and claim that the problem with public education is a lack of funding. We just need a little more. Just need a little more money. We just need a little more. But we know it's not just about money. As I've talked about before, one of the big problems with American education is the influence of John Dewey, the father of progressive education. You know, you guys want to huff and puff about stuff like critical race nonsense getting into the schools. You guys should be equally as outraged over progressive education and John Dewey's influence, which is a very anti-reason, anti-conceptual approach to learning. John Dewey thought that Aristotle's logic was outdated and long overdue for a change.
That's just not smart.
John Dewey thought that the mere acquirement of knowledge was a selfish affair and did not see it as a quote-unquote social benefit. And John Dewey even has an influence in private schools in the United States, but Dewey, from what I know, does not have much influence outside of the United States, which I think is probably a reason why students in schools in places like Europe and Japan perform better, despite spending fewer dollars in a lot of cases. Which I think is even more reason to privatize education, because it would open the door for better thinkers to come in and compete John Dewey's goofy ass out of the market. And then there's also this issue of complacency. If you talk to teachers, they'll often tell you that there's only so much they can do to prepare kids. A lot of these lackluster, disappointing test results that I've talked about, you can't really blame all of that on the schools and the teachers. There are just a lot of kids who just don't care. They don't try. They don't apply themselves. They don't do their homework. They don't study for tests. Even worse, their parents don't care. I've had people tell me that a lot of parents just think of public schools essentially as free babysitting, and as a result, they've deferred all responsibility to teaching and educating their kids to the state. They don't really take an active role in their child's education. And while I'm sure there's truth to this, I think it's impossible to measure how much of this plays a role in the poor testing results. And then there's this debate, which is kind of like a which came first, the chicken or the egg debate, where maybe public schools are responsible for a lot of the complacency. You know, the parents, they don't have any skin in the game. They have nothing to lose. Whereas if they had to pony up the money and take extra effort and focus on where they're sending their kids to school, if they actually had to spend their own money, they'd be more on their kids. Like, yeah, you better be doing your fucking homework, Ralphie. You better be studying. I'm only spending $28,000 to send you to a school in New York City. Although, again, that's all speculation. Either way, even if complacency amongst students and parents is a real issue, it's worth noting that none of this would be magically solved by merely throwing more money at the problem, which, again, throwing more money is often proposed as the solution in public education. And if you ask me, this is even more reason to privatize education. If your kid isn't going to give a shit about his education, if he's not going to take advantage of the opportunities that we as a society are providing to them, if you're not going to get involved in your kid's education, if you're not going to care about your kid's education, then why should I be forced to care about your kid's education via raising my taxes to fund his education? Tell you what, reduce my tax burden and take your ungrateful crumb cruncher home and never ask me for money again. And then I'm going to hear more, but without public schools, some kids, they might fall behind. They might not be proficient at reading, writing, and arithmetic. And as I've demonstrated, that already seems to be a problem despite giving government a near monopoly on education and spending generous amounts of money on public education. Even on top of that, unionizing the workforce in a lot of these public school districts. Again, the public schools, a lot of these public school districts, they seem to be a wet dream for a lot of socialists, yet they don't seem to be performing very well. On top of that, I think this is such a low, pessimistic view of humanity that if we were to leave education and teaching kids how to think to the private sector, that they would not meet the demands of children. This is an issue that James Tooley talks about in his book, The Beautiful Tree.
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
He talks a lot about how he went to poorer countries like India and communist China and various places in Africa. and how he found out about how in a lot of these places, I have not read the entire book, but he talks about how in a lot of these countries, the well-funded government schools are mostly available to children of politically connected parents. So the poorest of the poor, as a result, have resorted to establishing small private schools for poorer students, for kids of poorer parents, that both run at a profit despite costing less per student than the well-funded government schools. And in a lot of cases, the students perform better than their counterparts in the government-run schools. And you can see James Tooley, he provides some graphs. They're kind of hard to read in the book because the charts are black and white. But as you can see, in Africa and India, the private schools perform better on scores than the government-run schools, with Tooley saying, in all the studies, the same pattern was found for the raw mean scores, with private recognized schools achieving the highest, followed by the private unrecognized and the government schools achieving the lowest scores, except for the sole case of the Urdu language achievement in Hyderabad. James Tooley talks about a case in China where he talked to a principal of one of these private schools asking why did he open the school. He said that he had been aware that the public school test scores were very low and the villagers did not want all of their children to be illiterate. Going on to talk about how the children took the public examinations in 5th grade. He had 5 cohorts of students tested up to now, and their scores were always better than those in public schools. Going on to talk about how tuition in his school was 60 yuan, about $7.50 per semester. On top of that, $3.13 per semester for textbooks and exercise books. The nearest public school charged $9.38 per semester, plus roughly the same charges for textbooks and exercise books. James Tooley also says, so what was the secret of success in these private schools for the poor? The report was very clear. In a private school, the teachers are accountable to the manager who can fire them, and through him or her to the parents who can withdraw their children. In a government school, the chain of accountability is much weaker as teachers have a permanent job with salaries and promotions unrelated to performance. This contrast is perceived with crystal clarity by the vast majority of parents. And then finally, James Tooley talks about someone who was against private schools, even for the poor in some of these countries. Talking about how in front of the group, talking about a critic of private schools, she launched into a tirade against such schools. They were ripping off the poor, she said, by unscrupulous business people who did not care a fig for anything other than profits. This did not gel at all with what I had seen in Hyderabad, where how could such people devote their weekends to science competitions and cyber Olympics if money was their sole motivation? Going on to talk about how her main problem, clearly based on well-intentioned personal convictions, was the question of equality, saying that if many or even a few parents had higher aspirations for their children and wanted to send them to private schools, then they should not be allowed to do so because it is not fair. What do I keep telling you guys about these issues? What do I keep telling you guys about the capitalism versus socialism debate? Do I need to tap the sign again? The capitalism versus socialism debate is not about economics. And you can see it in James Tooley's book with people who take an issue with private education, even if it does help the poorest of the poor. And we can keep going on talking about school districts in the United States. According to this article on WKRN News, 75% of Nashville third graders are not reading on grade level. There's also articles about Alabama, about how Alabama is dead last in test scores. It's a wake-up call for officials who I guess are spending, according to another article, I think I read that they spend roughly $9,000 in Alabama. The average amount spent per student is $9,400 per student per year on education. Going back to U.S. News and World Report, let's look at some other districts, shall we? This is the Dallas Independent School District, who I guess spends roughly $10,000 per student per year. And in Dallas, I guess, I guess they do better than the other schools we looked at. High schoolers in Dallas, 85% of them are proficient in mathematics. 67% are proficient in reading. Not sure that should be, I don't know if that's a good statistic, but it's a lot better than a lot of the other statistics I've seen that I've shown, where they spend a lot more money than Dallas with even worse results. But then we also have the Jackson Public School District in Mississippi, which, according to U.S. News and World Report, they spend $10,500 per student per year on education, roughly the same as Dallas. They have much lower test scores. 13% of Jackson, Mississippi public high school students are proficient in math. 19% of Jackson public high school students are proficient in reading. In St. Louis, Missouri, the St. Louis Public Schools, according to U.S. News and World Report, spends almost $16,000 per student per year on education. And 28% of students in St. Louis Public Schools are proficient in mathematics. 40% are proficient in reading. Going back to the U.S. Census Bureau, they mentioned how Washington, D.C. is another school district that spends a lot of money, $22,400. Let's bring it up. Let's bring it up right here. Washington, D.C., they spend $22,400 per student per year on education. Yet, according to Nation's Report Card, in 2019, when looking at Washington, D.C. 8th graders, only 55% of Washington, D.C. 8th graders were at basic or above when it came to math, and only 58% were at basic or above when it came to reading. Again, $22,400 per student per year, and this is the results they get. And we can go on all day. I'm sure you, the viewers, if you're curious, you can look into Nation's Report Card, U.S. News and World Report, and look into these districts yourself and see how much they spend on public education and what kind of results they get. But why don't you let me know in the comments, what do you guys think of public education? Do you think it's working wonders? Do you think the solution is to spend more money on public education? Do you think it's time we maybe think about privatizing education in the United States? Let me know in the comments down below.